Hey up everybody, welcome back to the Ardu Cycling YouTube channel, where today I am going to be previewing the next round of the VELOGAMES Super Classico. It is the GP of Quebec. This race hasn't been with us for a few years. The last time it happened was in 2019. We got some real superstars lining up on this start list, including Wout and Tadej Pogacar, both of whom are 32 credits. And these two are the big favourites for the race. I think Wout just edges it. I think that's what the bookies say. And I think you're really going to need a good reason to not put Wout on your team here, considering just how good he's looking recently. At Britannia Classic, he was doing so much work and he still had enough energy to sprint for the win. I really think that he is the favourite and that you have to put him onto your team. Pogacar, I could forgive you for not putting him on because perhaps the course isn't completely suited towards him. Perhaps he would favour the GP of Montreal because it's a bit tougher, a bit more kind of elevation gain. I still think that Pogacar is a very good choice. He does have a fast sprint. We saw that at the Longwy stage at the Tour de France this year. Pogacar and Wout are both good picks, but I think I would say that Wout is the favourite who I would say you have to put on. Nizzolo I probably won't put on because I don't think he's climbing good enough. I don't think that Sagan really is either. I know that he won a stage in the Tour de Suisse earlier this year, but I don't really think that warrants me putting him on. I think that Stuyven and Greg are actually some of the better 24-point riders, just because they're both showing some good form recently. Stuyven at the Tour of Denmark, and Greg just really since like the Tour of Wallonie, and then through to like the Deutschland Tour recently, he's looked really good. And I think that he is probably the strongest rider that AG2R have, stronger than Kuznetsov, dare I say. I think that Stuyven, they do have some other options, Trek Segafredo, who could be more attacking choices, but I think that Stuyven would be their choice if it came down to a sprint, and he is the kind of rider who suits this kind of race. I think that Yates probably doesn't suit this course, but would probably suit Montreal a bit better. Go-Do, you have to think back to stage 3 of the Dauphiné where he won when Wout celebrated too early. Go-Do is not slow in a sprint. I think that he could certainly come top 10, but Matthews also at 22, it could be a safer choice, considering that, you know, he's really just, his history in this race is just impeccable. He's finished so many times inside the top 10, he's won it before, but of course there is a question of, you know, at the Maryland Classic and at Britannia Classic he was dropped, and I'm not really sure why that is, whether it's an issue with his form or an issue with his fueling strategy. I don't really know what it is, but there are some question marks about Matthews, which is making me a little bit apprehensive about putting him on. Arambarou seems a bit safer at 20. After all, Matthews and Arambarou both need to be fighting for the UCI points, considering that they are on the cusp of relegation. Arambarou, of course, won the Tour de Limousin, 12th at Britannia Classic, looks a pretty safe option for a top 10, maybe a top 5, or on a really good day a podium, but I don't think he's fast enough to win the race. Bardet and Barguil, you know, might come somewhere between kind of 10th and 15th on a good day. Kuznetsov, as I said earlier, just hasn't looked brilliant recently, but does have a tendency to randomly pull out really good results. Thinking back, like Britannia Classic last year in 2021 is a good example of that. Fuglsang I won't pick. Laporte, if there's a scenario where perhaps Pogacar manages to attack and draw away a group containing Wout and Christophe Laporte, I think that Laporte would be a great choice, but his bracket of usefulness is quite niche, so I'd probably say that it's probably better to go with somebody like Arambarou instead, who's like an out-and-out leader. Mohoric, it wouldn't surprise me if he came out of the woodwork and just did a really good ride, to be honest with you. He's that kind of rider who can just come out of nowhere and just do really well. Magnus Cort Nielsen doesn't have a great tendency in one-day races. Just go look at his PCS to kind of find that. But they do need UCI points to EF, and he is probably their fastest finisher, so I think that he will probably finish inside the top 10. I think that they definitely need him to try and do that. Costa and Formulo, and probably Ulissi will be working for Pogacar, although Ulissi has done very well in this race in the past, finishing multiple times inside the top 10. Garcia, Cortina and Tadej and Sepp Mark really just don't suit this kind of race, although Ivan Garcia Cortina has finished on the podium of the GP of Montreal, a theoretically harder race in the past, so maybe you could pick him on if he's on a good day. Bajoli, I think Quickstep will be working for Honore, who's another 16-pointer, so I'd probably say that Honore is a better choice than Bajoli just based off of recent form. Bettiol and Bilbao both look good at the Deutschland Tour. I think Bettiol is climbing incredibly well, and Bilbao is surprisingly fast. Just think back to Basque Country where he won a stage, and he also in like Tour of the Alps where he won a stage from sprints. Bilbao has a very underrated sprint and could certainly finish in the cyber top 5, not probably the top 10 in this race. You've also got Jonas Zagir, he's looking good, was good at the Britannia Classic, but again lacks the qualities to do well in this race. I think that he'd prefer Montreal. Patrick Conrad was looking really good at the Beamer Classic, but then got dropped at Deutschland, so I'm not sure about what to make of his form at the moment, but I think he will be leading the Bora Hansgrohe team. And then other than that, I don't really rate the rest of the 16 pointers. And actually, I don't rate too many of the 14 pointers, other than possibly Simon Clark and Søren Kragh Andersen, really. You could also maybe pick Aurelien Palis-Pantler, possibly. Best 12-point rider, I think, is Guerrero, and then also probably Paulus and Tom Schoens, just because they've all looked pretty good in form recently, especially Tom Schoens, actually. I think that could be quite a nice differential pick if you're wanting to go a little bit more crazy. Nick Schultz would be a good alternative to Michael Matthews if you don't think that Matthews is going to be there. If you don't trust his form, Nick Schultz would be the next best man. Quinn Simmons could be a good attacking option, but this isn't really a race that's won by attackers, it's won through a sprint at the end. Speaking of, Biniam Girmay is the best 8-point rider that you can go with. I'd probably say that alongside Wout and Aert, you have to put on Biniam Girmay. If you put on those two, I think that you'll be doing pretty well. So I think that Girmay is an absolute nailed on pick. He's the best 8-pointer, and I don't really rate many of the other 8-pointers. So moving on to the 6-pointers, there are quite a few that I like the look of. So Hugo Hull, I think, will be leading Israel. At the end of the day, he's a Canadian rider in a Canadian race. And quite frankly, I don't trust the ability of Nizzolo or Sepp Mark to be contesting the finish. So I think that Hugo Hull, who's finished inside the top 15 in this race before, would probably be their best rider. Alexander Kamp can kind of just come out of nowhere and do really well. We saw that at Britannia Classic just last week. And we also saw it at the Amstel Gold Race earlier this year. Alexander Kamp, I think he seems to favour the kind of circuit races, whereas like multiple laps of a certain circuit. So perhaps he would really like this sort of race. He is the Danish champion, so he's clearly, a very strong rider. And I think that for 6 points, he's very low risk for like a potentially really big reward. He could come top 5 in my opinion. Sylvain Monique has looked good recently, but would probably be better at the GP of Montreal. Piccolo has been an absolute revelation in the last few weeks. I think that he is probably the most solid 6 points that you could go with, alongside the fact that EF do have a lot of very good riders in this race, so I'm not sure which one we're going to be picking. Piccolo might be a domestique, just bear that in mind. Christian Scaroni is another good one. He would probably be the best rider that Astana would have in this race, so I think that he is a very underrated pick and could, be a bit of a good differential. Possibly Schmidt and Tratnik would be other good options, but perhaps not as good as the ones that I've just mentioned. And then you got some okay 4-point riders that I'd like to point out, which include Jonathan Milan, who had some pretty good punchy kind of results in the Tour of Poland, so perhaps he could survive, but he might also be a domestique for the likes of Bilbao and Mohoric, so bear that in mind. But I think my favourite one is actually Pierre-André Cote, who is the Canadian national champion, so it makes sense that the Canadian national champ would want to probably be in the breakaway in the biggest Canadian races. That just makes a lot of sense to me, so I think that he could be a pretty safe one to go with. In terms of what I'm thinking of going with, there's this team on the screen right now, but the alternative for me would be to not go with Pogacar and instead save and go with Michael Matthews, and then put those 10 points into somebody like Hugo Hull and get a 16-pointer, possibly Mikel Frolicanore or Alberto Bettiol, in which case the team would look like that. So let me know in the comments down below which one you think is best, also who you're thinking of putting onto your teams. And all that is left to say is to keep safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video. Salut!